Walking along London streets during the summer of 1945, you would have witnessed flags displayed from windows and heard the ringing of church bells in celebration. The war had concluded. Germany lay defeated. Britain emerged victorious in humanity's greatest conflict. Photographs captured jubilant crowds filling Trafalgar Square, waving Union Jacks and shouting until their voices faded. Yet underneath the festivities and confetti existed a silence nobody wished to confront. The silence of depleted coffers. Britain had achieved battlefield victory, but suffered defeat in its financial accounts. Though bombs no longer fell, the invoices were just beginning to accumulate. The nation that once provided financing to half the globe now found itself quietly requesting extensions and credit lines. Not from adversaries, but from allies. Not for armaments, but for sustenance, energy, and continuation. To comprehend how the British Empire genuinely concluded, we must examine beyond territorial maps and military forces to study the financial records. We learn that empires perish in combat. We hear they collapse when invaders breach defenses or colonies mount armed uprisings. Yet the British Empire did not perish by warfare. It perished through financial documentation. It was deconstructed not by revolutionaries but by financial professionals in Washington and banking executives in New York who grasped a straightforward, frightening reality. Whoever controls the debt controls the debtor. The financial foundation. Prior to the conflict, Britain served as the undisputed global banker. London functioned as international finance's nucleus. The sterling zone formed an extensive economic structure covering 1/4 of Earth's surface. From Australia to India, from Egypt to South Africa, commerce occurred in British pounds. Currency flowed into London from every imperial corner and redistributed like circulation through an imperial organism. This financial supremacy enabled Britain to exert influence beyond its physical capacity. It could finance an enormous naval fleet. It could extend authority into the Middle East and Asia. It could maintain trade imbalances because the world perpetually required pounds. However, warfare transformed everything. To combat the Nazi military apparatus, Britain had to expend resources it lacked at unprecedented velocity. Manufacturing facilities operated continuously. Vessels were constructed, destroyed, and reconstructed. Entire urban areas were bombed and rebuilt while conflict continued. The empire mobilized not for profit but for continuation, and continuation demands resources. By 1945, Britain owed unprecedented amounts throughout its entire existence. The obligation was tangible and oppressive. Britain had liquidated its foreign holdings to purchase weaponry. It had sold investments in American transportation networks and Argentine agricultural estates that required generations to establish. It had extracted gold from Bank of England storage facilities and transported it across the Atlantic. The sterling balances scheme. The most astonishing financial operation during wartime was not American borrowing. It was borrowing from the empire itself. This chapter often disappears from educational materials. It became known as the Sterling Balances Arrangement. To conduct warfare in Asia and North Africa, Britain required provisions. It needed clothing, sustenance, munitions, and raw resources. A substantial portion originated from India. Yet Britain lacked funds to compensate India for these commodities, so they created a mechanism that essentially functioned as an extensive forced loan. When a British commander in India purchased supplies, he compensated the Indian producer, not in gold or dollars, but in rupees. But where did those rupees originate? They were manufactured by the colonial administration in Delhi. In exchange for creating these rupees, the British administration in London deposited a promissory note in a London bank account. This account contained the so-called sterling balances. On documentation, India appeared to prosper. The London balance expanded beyond £1.3 billion, a staggering amount equivalent to roughly $45 billion in contemporary currency. But in actuality, India experienced exploitation. The rupees flooding the Indian economy generated massive inflation. Costs skyrocketed. Bengal's impoverished population could no longer purchase rice because the currency supply had inflated to fund British military operations. This inflation directly caused the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed millions. Britain essentially conducted warfare using credit issued under its starving subjects' names. The strategy was straightforward. Britain would achieve victory and somehow compensate India subsequently, perhaps. The American creditor. The largest creditor was not India, but the United States. The relationship between Britain and America during conflict appeared publicly as an equal partnership. Two great English-speaking democracies standing united against oppression. Churchill and Roosevelt were portrayed as companions sharing freedom's vision. Yet beneath ceremonies and photograph sessions, the power equilibrium had permanently shifted. America became the lender, Britain became the borrower, and borrowers cannot establish regulations. Initially during conflict, Britain compensated America for weaponry under a mechanism called cash and carry. Britain literally transferred gold and currency for every rifle and tank. When currency depleted, Britain approached Roosevelt with a straightforward predicament. Without American assistance, Britain would lose the conflict. Roosevelt provided assistance, but it wasn't complimentary. It arrived with stipulations that would reshape the post-conflict world. The arrangement was termed lend-lease. Superficially, it seemed charitable. America would lend Britain weaponry, sustenance, petroleum, and raw resources for conflict's duration. Britain would compensate later or return equipment. But Americans inserted provisions into lend-lease agreements designed to dismantle the British Empire's economic monopoly. They demanded that Britain commit to dismantling the imperial preference structure. This trade mechanism favored empire goods over goods from elsewhere. It was the economic adhesive maintaining empire cohesion. America wanted that adhesive dissolved. They sought access to Indian, African, and Australian markets. They wanted the British Empire to stop being an exclusive organization and become an accessible marketplace for American exports. The Bretton Woods defeat. Throughout warfare, British economists like John Maynard Keynes fought a desperate defensive action against American planners like Harry Dexter White. This struggle culminated at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Bretton Woods is renowned for establishing the IMF and World Bank, but Bretton Woods' genuine narrative is Britain's defeat. Keynes arrived with a strategy to rescue the British economy. He proposed a new global currency called the Bankor. It was designed to assist debtor nations like Britain by penalizing creditor nations like America. It was a brilliant mechanism that would have permitted Britain to recover gracefully. Harry Dexter White, the American negotiator, crushed it. He knew America controlled all advantages. He knew Britain was insolvent. He insisted on a framework built around the US dollar and gold, a framework favoring the nation with resources. Britain had no alternative but to sign. They were signing their own execution warrant as a global authority, the abrupt termination. Then came the shock. And when conflict concluded in 1945, Britain assumed the lend-lease arrangement would continue temporarily to permit recovery. The nation was exhausted. Rationing was stricter after conflict than during it. There was no bread. There was no coal. The housing inventory was pulverized. But the moment Japan surrendered in August 1945, President Truman terminated the supply abruptly, without warning. One day, supplies flowed. The next day, they ceased. Vessels already at sea carrying wheat and petroleum to Britain were ordered to reverse direction and return to America unless Britain could pay in cash. Britain had no cash. It had no dollars. Its gold had vanished. Its industry was exhausted. Britain had achieved conflict victory and lost the peace in a single afternoon. The loan agreement. With no alternative remaining, the British government dispatched a delegation to Washington led by Keynes. They were not negotiating as equals. They were pleading. Keynes hoped for a grant, a gift from one ally to another recognizing Britain's sacrifice. The Americans refused. There would be no gift. There would only be a loan. And the loan would arrive with restrictions so severe they would strangle the British economy for decades. In 1946, Britain signed the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. They borrowed $3.75 billion. It was the largest loan America had ever issued, but the stipulations were lethal. Condition 1, Britain had to pay interest. This shocked the British public who believed they had fought a shared conflict. Condition 2, Britain had to dismantle the sterling zone. The Americans demanded that sterling become convertible. This meant anyone holding British pounds, whether an Egyptian merchant or Australian bank, could demand to exchange those pounds for US dollars. This was a trap. America knew everyone globally wanted dollars to purchase American commodities. Nobody wanted pounds to purchase British commodities because British industry was destroyed. If Britain made the pound convertible, everyone would sell their pounds and purchase dollars. Britain's reserves would drain instantly. Keynes warned against it. He stated it was premature. He stated the British economy was too weak. But Americans were adamant. They wanted the British marketplace open. They wanted the empire's protective barriers demolished. Britain signed. They accepted the currency because they had to eat. The convertibility crisis. The crisis arrived exactly as predicted. In 1947, Britain fulfilled its promise and made sterling convertible. The outcome was a financial massacre. Within weeks, nations across the globe rushed to dispose of their British pounds and purchase American dollars. Britain's foreign currency reserves drained at terrifying velocity. It was a bank run, but the bank was the United Kingdom. The government panicked. Convertibility was suspended after only 5 weeks, but the damage was complete. The loan that was supposed to last for years had been consumed in months. Confidence in sterling was shattered. The illusion of British financial supremacy evaporated. From that moment forward, Britain was no longer a global financial authority. It was a supplicant, a client state. Every policy decision made in London was now constrained by the necessity to defend the currency. Every government budget was haunted by the fear of capital flight, imperial dissolution. The empire itself was becoming too costly to maintain. Maintaining overseas installations, garrisons, and administrations required resources Britain no longer possessed. The colonies were no longer assets. They were liabilities. India was first to depart, the jewel in the crown. Britain owed India billions in those sterling balances. It could not compensate. It could not afford to govern. It could not afford to police the rising tensions. In 1947, Britain left India. Not after an extended transition, not after careful planning, but hastily. The decision was made rapidly and executed poorly. The result was partition, violence, and chaos. Britain did not depart as a confident imperial authority reshaping the world. It departed as an insolvent landlord fleeing a building he could no longer maintain. Other colonies followed. Palestine was abandoned to chaos. Burma was released. Ceylon gained independence. Across Africa and Asia, the same pattern repeated. Britain did not fight to retain the empire because it could not afford the overhead. There were no glorious final stands. There was paperwork, timetables, withdrawals. This was not Rome's fall. It was the liquidation of a failing enterprise. The devaluation of 1949. By the end of the 1940s, Britain had stabilized but at a reduced level. It had accepted its status as a junior partner. But the humiliation was not finished. The financial constraint was still tightening. The pound was fixed at $4.3 before the conflict. It was a symbol of British strength. But in 1949, with the economy struggling and the dollar shortage acute, the British government was forced to do the unthinkable. They devalued the pound. Overnight, the value of currency in every British person's pocket dropped by 30% against the dollar. It was a public admission of failure. It was an admission that Britain could no longer compete. The exchange rate fell to $2.80. The 1940s concluded with Britain victorious but broken. The empire was dissolving. The currency was devalued. The debt was mountainous. But the political elite in London still believed in the illusion. They still believed that Britain could function as a great authority. They still believed they could sit at the top table. They were mistaken. And it would require a crisis in the Egyptian desert to prove it to them. The 1950s recovery illusion. The 1950s were supposed to be the recovery era. The Festival of Britain in 1951 showcased a nation anticipating a future of jet engines, nuclear energy, and modern architecture. There was a sense that the worst had passed. Rationing was slowly being lifted. The new Queen Elizabeth II had ascended to the throne, promising a new Elizabethan age. But behind the pageantry, the financial decay was spreading. The British economy was suffering from a chronic condition known as stop-go. When the government attempted to stimulate economic growth, imports would surge. Because British industry was uncompetitive, people purchased German washing machines and American automobiles instead of British ones. This caused a balance of payments crisis. Currency flowed out of the nation. The pound weakened. To preserve the pound, the government would have to apply brakes forcefully, raising interest rates and reducing spending. The economy would halt. This cycle repeated itself continuously. Britain could not grow without going broke. But the political class refused to accept the reality of their diminished status. They clung to the notion that Britain was still a superpower equal to the United States and the Soviet Union. This delusion crashed directly into reality in 1956 at the Suez Canal, the Suez catastrophe. The Suez Canal was more than a waterway. It was the empire's jugular vein. It connected Britain to the Middle East's oil fields and Asia's markets. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, Britain saw it as an act of theft and an existential threat. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was a man of the old world. He believed that Britain could not allow a former colony to dictate terms. He conspired with France and Israel to launch a secret invasion. The plan was for Israel to attack Egypt across the Sinai, and for Britain and France to intervene as peacekeepers, essentially seizing the canal back. Militarily, the operation was successful. British paratroopers dropped onto the canal zone. They secured the objectives. The Egyptian army was routed. From a military perspective, it was a textbook victory. But the battle was not decided on Egypt's sands. It was decided in New York's trading rooms and Washington's Oval Office. President Eisenhower was furious. He had not been consulted. He saw the invasion as a relic of old-fashioned colonialism that would push the Arab world into the Soviet Union's arms. He wanted the British out. He did not send the U.S. Navy to stop the British fleet. He used a weapon far more powerful. He attacked the pound. The United States Treasury began selling British pounds on currency markets. Sterling's value began to plummet. Simultaneously, Britain needed to draw on emergency funds from the IMF to stabilize its currency. Eisenhower blocked the request. He told the British government bluntly that if they did not withdraw their troops, he would crash the British economy. Britain was days away from national bankruptcy. The gold reserves were hemorrhaging. The nation literally could not afford to keep its troops in the field for another week without American financial support. Anthony Eden had no choice. He was humiliated. He ordered a ceasefire and withdrawal. Suez was the moment the illusion died. It was the psychological turning point of the 20th century for Britain. The world saw that Britain could no longer act independently. Its military power was useless because it was funded by American credit. The empire had ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a currency run. The 1960s decline. After Suez, Britain entered a period of introspection. The 60s were the era of the Beatles and Rolling Stones, of cultural revolution and swinging London. But economically, it was a decade of decline. The gap between Britain and its European competitors widened. Germany and France were booming, growing at 5 or 6% annually. Britain sputtered along at 2%. The empire continued to dissolve. In 1960, Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, delivered his famous Wind of Change speech in South Africa, acknowledging that colonial rule's days were finished. Colony after colony was granted independence. The Union Jack was lowered in Lagos and Nairobi, in Kuala Lumpur. But the financial constraint remained. The pound was fixed at $2.80, a rate established in 1949. By the mid-60s, this rate was too elevated. British exports were too expensive. But defending this exchange rate became a matter of national pride. To devalue again was seen as national defeat. The 1967 devaluation. The Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, elected in 1964, fought a 3-year battle to preserve the pound. He sacrificed everything to defend that $280 figure. He reduced public spending. He froze wages. He canceled aircraft carrier projects. He taxed imports. He borrowed heavily from central banks. It was a war of attrition against the financial markets. Wilson lost. In November 1967, the pressure became too great. Speculators were selling pounds by the billion. The reserves were empty. Wilson was forced to devalue the pound from $2.80 to $2.40. That evening, he appeared on television to explain the disaster to the British people. He looked tired. He tried to spin the defeat as a technical adjustment. And then he said the phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said, "It does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued." It was a lie, or at best a delusion. Of course, the pound in the pocket was worth less. Britain imported half its food and most of its raw materials. The price of bread, tea, fuel, and clothes rose immediately. The standard of living fell. The British people realized that their leaders were not just powerless. They were dishonest about their powerlessness. The 1970s catastrophe. The 1970s brought the final reckoning. It was a decade of chaos. The oil price shock of 1973 hit Britain harder than anyone else. Inflation soared to 25%. Unions demanded higher wages to keep pace with prices. Strikes paralyzed the nation. The lights went out. The garbage piled up. The dead went unburied. Britain was called the sick man of Europe. The government spent resources it didn't possess to prop up failing industries like British Leyland. They printed currency to pay government wages. The deficit exploded. By 1976, the markets had seen enough. They stopped lending to Britain. The pound went into freefall, dropping below $2. For the first time in history, the government was running out of cash to pay its bills day to day. The IMF humiliation. In September 1976, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey, was on his way to the airport to fly to a conference. He received a call. The markets were crashing. He turned the car around. Healey had to do the unthinkable. He had to apply to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. This was a humiliation without precedent. The IMF was designed to help developing nations. It was for struggling economies in Latin America or Asia. It was not for the United Kingdom, the victor of World War II, the former ruler of the empire. But Britain had no choice. A team of IMF inspectors arrived in London. They went through the books. They dictated terms. They demanded massive reductions in public spending. They demanded the sale of state assets. They demanded that Britain stop living a lie. Britain accepted the terms. They took the loan of $3.9 billion. It was the largest loan in IMF history. The 1976 crisis was the absolute nadir. It was the moment Britain finally accepted that it was just a normal country. The imperial pretensions were gone. The financial dominance was a distant memory. The nation was broke and under the supervision of international accountants. The transformation. But from the ashes of this disaster, a new Britain began to emerge. And this is the twist in the tale. The restrictions imposed by the IMF forced a change in thinking. The old model of state control and imperial preference was dead. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power with a radical new agenda. She did not try to rebuild the territorial empire. She understood that land was no longer the source of wealth. The source of wealth was capital. In 1986, her government unleashed the Big Bang. They deregulated the financial markets of London. They invited the American banks, Japanese banks, and European banks to come to London and conduct business with almost no restrictions. They transformed London from the capital of a British empire into the capital of a global financial empire, a dark offshore empire. Britain realized that if it couldn't rule the world with battleships, it could rule it with bank accounts. They created a network of tax havens in their remaining territories: the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda. These tiny islands became the places where the world's corporations and oligarchs hid their resources, and the web was centered on the City of London. The final irony. So the story of how the U.S. bankrupted the British Empire ends with a strange irony. The United States stripped Britain of its colonies. It stripped Britain of its industry. It stripped Britain of its reserve currency status. It forced Britain to play by American rules. But Britain adapted. It became the service provider to the new American global order. It became the banker for the globalization that America created. The flags in Trafalgar Square in 1945 waved for a victory that was already hollow. The British people paid a terrible price for that victory. They paid with their savings. They paid with their empire. They paid with decades of austerity. They fought a war they could not afford to save a world that would no longer belong to them. Today, Britain is a wealthy nation again, but the wealth is different. It is not the wealth of production or of empire. It is the wealth of the middleman, the wealth of the dealmaker. The ghost of the empire still haunts the country. You see it in London's architecture. You see it in the debates about Britain's place in the world. But the reality is found in the ledger. The British Empire didn't end with a bang. It ended with a loan agreement. It ended with a devalued currency. It ended with a fax from the IMF. And the lesson is one that every superpower should learn. You can have the strongest navy in the world. You can have the bravest soldiers. You can have the most righteous cause. But if you run out of money, you lose. The ledger always wins.